Hi, I'm Mike Snyder from Shoemaker, Loop and Kendrick. I'm a partner that practices in the Environmental Practice Group out of the Columbus, Ohio office. I want to welcome you to our seminar on the re-emergence of environmental justice, and thank you for attending. I think everybody knows the election and the Biden administration starting to settle in has brought a lot of changes across the board, but in environmental law, environmental justice is, I guess, the big buzzword right now. It's something that those of us that have practiced environmental law or worked in the area for years have seen emerge and then kind of go back and then come back forward again into the present tense. We're never sure how much emphasis it's going to get, but what's becoming clear, I think, to everybody right now is that it's going to be very important to the Biden administration, and I think there's potential for it to impact your company, your law practice, whatever it may be. So today we're having a short seminar hoping that we can shed some light on history of environmental justice. What is it? How does it work? And what's going on right now with the new administration that might actually impact your facility's operations or your community. I'm joined today by Marcus Miller, an associate in our Columbus office that practices environmental law and litigation, and Dean Northern from Ohio State University. And so with that, we're going to kick things off with Marcus talking a little bit about the history of environmental justice. Thanks, Marcus.
No problem. Thank you, Mike. Again, my name is Marcus Miller. I'm an associate here in the Columbus, Ohio office, practicing in the litigation and environmental practice groups. This morning, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the history of environmental justice, the definition, walk through where it began, how it kind of got its momentum, some studies about its impact on communities, and then a couple of well-known examples that you most likely have seen in the news at some point in time. So to start off, the Environmental Protection Agency defines environmental justice as the fair, thank you, Wendy, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So we'll go into some examples later on, but overall the theme is how do government and industry decisions, in fact, impact minority and low-income communities. So next slide, please. As Mike touched on, it doesn't take a lot of research to throw a stone and see that the Biden administration has made this a top priority, and you can look all over the place and find headlines talking about their focus and emphasis on environmental justice. Next. However, the environmental justice movement started for a lot of people in the 60s. So first you had Latino workers in the San Joaquin Valley in California who were protesting for worker rights as well as the use of pesticides in the farming. This actually led to a ban of the pesticide DDT in the 1970s. You also had, in 1968, the Memphis sanitation worker strike. This strike focused on safe working conditions and the rights and recognition of sanitation workers. The strike led to 100 demonstrators being jailed, several beaten, and the deaths of 2 people, including the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Next slide, please. The environmental justice movement really started taking shape, though, in the 1980s. And a lot of people look to Afton, North Carolina, specifically Warren County, as kind of the impetus for the movement. In Warren County, residents protested the state's plan to move PCB contaminated soil from approximately 210 miles of roadway to a landfill that was located in, at the time, one of the only majority minority communities in the state. The state ultimately succeeded in its placement of the contaminated soil, but the environmental justice movement had gained some traction by then. And then following the Warren County protests, you had a United States General Accounting Office study that was requested by Congressman Walter Fauntroy, who was actually arrested during the Warren County protests. The study basically looked at the correlation between location of hazardous waste landfills and the racial and economic status of the surrounding communities. The study was focused on 8 southeastern states in particular, and it found that the hazardous waste sites were disproportionately located in Black communities, and all of the communities studied fell below the poverty line. Next. Following the Warren County protests and the GAO study, administrations in the 90s began to attempt, anyways, to address the Environmental Justice Initiative. You had George H.W. Bush in 1992. His administration established the Office of Environmental Equity, which is now known as the Office of Environmental Justice. This office coordinates agency efforts to address the needs of vulnerable populations. It helps provide financial and technical assistance to communities who are trying to address environmental justice issues. And it also attempts to work with local, state, and federal governments, as well as community organizations and business and industry folks, to establish partnerships that can help achieve protection for environmental and health standards. Next, you also had President Clinton, who signed an executive order in 1994, which directed agencies similar, I think Mike may touch on this later, to the Biden order recently. The Clinton order directed agencies to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental effects on minority and low-income populations. It also directed agencies to develop a strategy for implementing environmental justice, and it also directed them to promote non-discrimination in federal programs that also affect environment and health and human safety. Next, please. So over the years, different administrations focused on environmental justice. You had a varied approach. This slide actually isn't just about the funding of Environmental Justice Office. It's a slide regarding the payments or the funding of the EPA in general, but I think it was a good representation of the varying degrees that certain administrations gave to environmental justice and the environment in general. I also, in looking at the kind of timeline here, I have a sneaking suspicion that if it was redone in a few years, that line, that blue line at the end, would probably start trending upwards as well. Next slide, please. So recent studies have shown, they've kind of supported the disparate impact that environmental pollution and hazards can play on minority and low-income communities. So there was a 2018 study published by the American Journal of Public Health. It focused on quantifying nationwide disparities in the location of particulate matter emitting facilities based on the characteristics of the surrounding community. The study found that those in poverty had a 1.35 times higher burden than did the overall population. It found that whites had a 1.28 times higher burden, non-whites, and then blacks specifically had a 1.5 times higher burden than did the overall population. The study concluded that there are definitely disparities in the burden from particulate matter emitting facilities, and the disparities are nationwide, and that took in varying factors, obviously location and the surrounding communities. There was an additional study done by the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. This one is a little bit more recent, actually published, I believe this year, and it was also found as similar as the previous 2018 Journal of Public Health study. Conclusion, viewing nearly all major emission categories and taking into account the varying factors nationwide, whether it's urban or rural areas, income level, exposure levels, particulate matter exposure disproportionately affected people of color. Next, please. So now we'll move into what a lot of people probably see in the news when they see examples of environmental justice. This first one here is what's known as Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley is a stretch of Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. It's nicknamed Cancer Alley because of its particularly high concentration of petrochemical facilities. In fact, I think in one stretch, 10-mile stretch of the river, there are approximately 30 large petrochemical plants in those communities. Next, please. These are two other, well-known, I think, examples of environmental justice. You have the Keystone XL pipeline, and you have the Flint water crisis in Flint, Michigan. I think these, although they don't necessarily pertain to siting of new facilities and permitting, they play into the overall arching theme of environmental justice, which is addressing the disparate impact of communities of color and low-income communities, and making sure that these communities are addressed or have a say when decisions are made that will affect their communities. Next slide, please. So this brings us back to the Biden administration, who, as mentioned earlier, has made environmental justice a priority. In the first few weeks of his administration, Biden issued several executive orders addressing environmental justice and ordering government agencies to make environmental justice a priority in their day-to-day administrations. It's essentially kind of bringing back into focus what we saw in the early 90s with the creation of the Environmental Justice Office and then the Clinton executive order. I think Mike will get into some of the specifics and a little bit of the practical effects of the Biden orders. But right now, I'm going to introduce Dean Kathy Seward Northern, who's going to go a little bit deeper into what environmental justice is and how it can be used to address industry decisions and affecting the surrounding communities. Dean Northern.
Thank you, and thanks to both you and Michael for inviting me to join this panel. One of the, in a minute, I'm going to tell a little bit more of a story to expand upon Marcus's description of kind of the history underlying the environmental justice movement. But I want to reflect on the title for a moment, the Re-Emergence of Environmental Justice. And I'm sure that there are some who might equate the re-emergence of environmental justice as a federal policy imperative with the anticipated re-emergence of the brood 10 cicadas. Every 17 years, we are visited with their loud and insistent noise for a period of time. And then that noise quiets down. So it's a cyclical yet a reality to be endured until the emergence has run its course, it's faded into obscurity, and we don't have to deal with it again for another set of years. With environmental justice, some people would look at it the same way, that it is a periodic re-emergence of noise associated with the disproportionate burden, environmental burden placed in communities of color or those of socioeconomic class, but then that noise will fade away. I really hope that we can persuade you to think of the reemergence of environmental justice policy more as a renaissance, a rebirth of a commitment to ensuring that no one community or set of communities bears a disproportionate share of the environmental burdens that's generated by our consumer culture. One of the things that I think is important, and Marcus has introduced us to this, is understanding the context in which our communities experience environmental benefit and environmental burden. So I'm going to just kind of shape for a second. Law professors like to do hypotheticals, and I've been teaching products liability and torts for the 30 years that I've been in academia. Before then, I practiced in those areas as an attorney with Porter. And the overall understanding of environmental justice really requires that you take at not just what your particular facility or your particular business or even type of business has contributed to concerns about disproportionate impact of environmental pollution or other environmental burdens, but really the context in which the communities operate that are most impacted. So just envision yourself in a community. It could be in Columbus, it could be any urban community. And certainly, as Marcus indicated, these concerns are also present in rural, but for the sake of just kind of an illustration, you are in a city that in the north. So Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, other major cities, for example, in the Midwest. In the 1920s and 1930s, these communities began to see the beginning of the Great Migration to cities in the North and Midwest. And for those of you who haven't heard that term, the Great Migration was the movement of Black people in the South to northern cities, to Midwest cities, where they saw opportunity to work in industry, where they saw opportunity to be free of the remnants of slavery, of Reconstruction, of Jim Crow laws, and to have opportunity, much like most immigrants come or move for opportunity. And so there was a significant movement from the South to the North of African-American people. In 1933, so we're just right in the midst of the Depression and efforts on the federal government to begin to build itself out of the Depression, and faced with the housing shortage, in part because of these migrations, the federal government begins a program that's explicitly designed to increase, and many would say to segregate, America's housing stock. Robert Rothstein, who has studied this movement and federal government reaction to the migration, talks about the fact that housing programs begun under the New Deal were tantamount to a state-sponsored system of segregation. And the reason that he says that is that government efforts were primarily designed to provide housing to white middle class, lower middle class families in the building of the suburbs. African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities and pushed instead into urban housing projects. The urban housing projects themselves were located in areas that often were already lower in housing value. They were areas in which the political clout to the construction of these projects was not very strong. And their presence tended to further reduce property values, making surrounding land even cheaper for purposes of like developing industry, for increased manufacturing, for the development of utilities, a wide range of enterprise that contributed significantly to the environmental burden in the areas surrounding their existence. We talk about these kind of often. You hear in the environmental justice or movement, the environmental the reference to LULUs, locally unwanted land uses. So these locally unwanted land uses were concentrated or tend to be concentrated in lower income communities and communities of color. Now, interestingly enough, there's some, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, particularly in the 40s and 50s when these housing projects were being developed, they were not only co-located in areas that had been zoned or planned for kind of industrial complexes or in the center of urban areas. They were located in areas in which federal housing policies also mandated segregation. In 1934, you had the Federal Housing Administration that is established, and that housing administration adopted a formal program of by refusing to insure mortgages that were located or near African American neighborhoods, a policy that many of you undoubtedly know as redlining. And so at the same time that certain economic benefits were being denied to these enclaves of African American neighborhoods that were often co-located with industry. And so, to answer those, well, why didn't people just move? If you can't purchase property in that area, if you can't move from that area, your options may be more narrow. At the same time, the FHA was subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for whites, with requirements that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. Take it further into the 1950s and 1960s. You're hearing a lot now about the interstate highway system, decisions of the planners of the interstate highway system, which was undoubtedly created significant benefit to the cities, particularly the larger cities that were being connected by this interstate system. And it began to take shape around the late 1950s. This system routed some of the highways directly and often purposefully through Black and brown communities. Part of it was economic, part of it was political. There wasn't the political clout to push back against certain locations. And some of the research has demonstrated that the path of the place, in fact, tracked some of the redlining that the federal government had already done in order to keep those communities of color cabined within certain aspects of the interstate. If you look at a map today of Columbus, Ohio, that shows demographic distribution, most of the African American community in Columbus lives to the east of 71, and for the most part, historically, to the south of 70. So there was a quadrant in the southeast part of the city that home to the majority of the African American population. That's extended north to some extent, but it still tends to be cabined within 270 and to the east of 71. As those of you who are familiar with the geography of Columbus, most of our industry is also within that southeast quadrant of the city. Now, bringing this to the kind of environmental push, obviously the highway system brought with it a significant amount of traffic. And up in 1950s and 1960s and on into the 1970s, lead gasoline was what was in use in cars. And those lead particulates from the gasoline exhaust was often, because of the location, disproportionately impacting upon, again, those lower income and those communities of color through which the highways traversed. And in Columbus, you have 71 and 70 obviously intersecting right in the middle of the African American community. And so we know that lead, and it was known at the time, that lead has significant, if a child is exposed within their first 5, 6, 7 years of life, can have significant impact on the ways in which the brain develops, the ways in which children have the ability to learn, to develop impulse control, and so a lot of cognitive disabilities associated with exposure to lead. And again, the burden in communities of color, in the African American community and lower income communities from this lead was significant. If you combine that with exposure to lead particulates that came from factories and other things, we have an environmental burden that not only impacts the individual who is physically in it, but impacts on communities. When you have a generation of children, many of whom may have not ever reached their full potential because of the exposure to toxins. And if you look, I'm just allude to this and then kind of move on from this example, but there have been studies that that demonstrate that one of the commonalities that one can find in prison populations, particularly for those individuals who are recidivist and continually interacting with the system, is actually a higher amount of lead in the bone marrow. There were studies done in the Pennsylvania prisons about 30 years ago showing this. And so I'm saying all that to say this. Obviously, those communities, the cost of land, the political lack of political clout and everything are factors that can be very attractive to industry with respect to where do we locate, what decisions do we make. And so from an environmental justice standpoint, understanding the background and history of the community that you're in, particularly with respect to the environmental burdens that have been imposed upon that community over a period of time, is key and essential to the environmental justice movement. Wendy, next slide, please. So on the next slide, you see a tunnel, and the focus then is that, if we talk about decisions to locate an environmentally burdensome facility or to expand operations, or perhaps even cease operations, or to change the nature of those operations, tend to be focused or based upon economic considerations. What are the economic costs associated with the proposed action? What are the political costs? Are there going to be widespread protest against the location or the expansion of this facility? Is the community going to be able to encourage local government to not permit or not provide access to the ability to expand? Those voices, that ability to do so, tends to still be louder in the suburban communities and other communities with economic resources than they are in the lower income communities or communities of color. Many of you will know the acronym of NIMBY, not in my backyard. And so businesses take into account whose backyard are they most likely to be able to play in at the least cost. What are the compliance costs of the proposed action? Is zoning, are there already other industries there? And so these primarily economic and political considerations that often go into decisions often don't take into account the context in which those decisions made, the communities within which those decisions are made, the environmental burden and the resulting cultural and societal impact of the environmental disparities that already exist. And sometimes not even thinking about, focusing on your particular media. Am I going to be contributing to air pollution or water pollution or soil pollution, and not thinking about the media that I'm not affecting? How do these things flow together? And so, in the slide, it references the fact that this kind of tunnel vision of only looking at the economic impact of the decisions that are being made and the regulatory impact, can I comply with governmental regulations, are one of the factors that lead significantly to environmental disparity and environmental justice. So next slide, Wendy. So what are we talking about when we are using these terms, the language, if you will, of environmental justice? When we talk about, and in this slide, this set of pictures is often used to give a visual of the difference between equality and equity and justice. So if you look at the slide that will be to your left, you have a barrier where you have three individuals of different heights that are seeking to see something on the other side of that barrier. They're all being treated equally in that they all have the same size and height of box that they are standing upon. And so, but that equal treatment doesn't allow each of them access to the good or to the benefit that they are seeking, that is to see whatever's on the other side of the fence. And in the environmental context, we would think about, even if now, because of environmental regulations and compliance, and one would argue that we are now making decisions on an equal basis across all of communities, you still wouldn't have achieved equity, because if you start from a point where people are at different levels already of environmental burden or lack of access to environmental benefits, then treating each of those each of those communities in the same way doesn't mean that they all have equal access. So then we talk about environmental equity, which is what you will see, the terminology you will most often see as Marcus alluded in terms of the, particularly the Bush and the Clinton efforts at environmental equity. And this is the notion that all populations should bear a proportionate share of the environmental pollution and the health risks that are associated, so that that there's an effort made to either spread the wealth of not just the environmental benefits, but the environmental burdens in a way that recognizes that some communities should not have any additional facilities cited there because they already have a disproportionate share of the environmental burden, and that other communities need to step up and to also have that share of the burden, or to have actions taken to reduce the environmental burden that already exists in those communities so as to achieve equity with communities that have not previously been burdened in the same way. Justice as a term and concept, and to some extent why you see the Biden the office being changed from that of the environmental equity to environmental justice, is that environmental justice encompasses both equity and equality. It's the achievement, if you will, one definition is the achievement of equal protection from environmental and health hazards for all people, regardless of race, income, culture, or social class. And so it is both treating people equitably in terms of recognizing the burdens that they already bear, and then moving forward also with equality, that all communities have equal levels of protection from environmental and health hazards, and that steps may be taken in communities that are already burdened to better achieve that equality of distribution of harms. Next slide. Moving somewhat quickly, just I wanted to give that kind of understanding of the kind of deeper contextual understanding of the communities that you operate in and that you're making decisions about, the need to go beyond just the current economic considerations that may be factors in your decision making, and having a more holistic view. You're going to hear about justice theories, and I'm not going to take a lot of time here, but when we're talking about justice theories, we're really talking about three kind of categories. Distributive justice that concerns the socially just allocation of resources. You may see it defined as perceived fairness of how rewards and costs are shared by or distributed among group members. So the major tenets of distributive justice are equality, proportionality, and fairness. Context matters. Corrective justice is perhaps the form of justice many of you are most familiar with, and that is the notion that looks to damages that are suffered by one party and inflicted by another. Torts, my field of study, really focuses in on corrective justice as a means of putting people back into the place that they would have been had an injury not occurred. It's a restorative notion, and but it's restorative to only a limited extent. Money damages doesn't change the physical outcome of exposure to toxins. In the example, for example, that I used with lead, it provides a form of justice, but it doesn't really change the outcome in many respects. The other type of justice theory that really much of the legislation and the effort of the Biden administration is procedural justice. And that procedural justice is kind of a normative judgment, fairness of the process of decision making. It boils down to who's participating, what's the nature of that participation, is that participation fair? So is it based upon democratic notions in which all affected people have the possibility to be informed, express their opinions, and influence their decisions? So next. And essentially when we're talking about fair treatment, it's defined to mean that no group of people, including racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic groups, should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, municipal, and commercial operations, or of federal, state, and local and tribal environmental programs and policies. Next. So I'm through these next quickly so that Michael can get to his, and hopefully we have some time for questions. But procedural justice and the notion of participation, it's what kind of participation that matters. You can have it kind of manifest in multiple ways. You can have what's often termed to be manipulative participation, where participation really is a pretense. You have someone who is supposed to represent the local community on an official board, but they're not elected. They may not be accountable to the community, and they may not have any real influence on decision making. They're there, if you will, as tokens or as a visual representation of participation, when that participation is not in fact one that has any impact on the decision. Almost no interaction occurs between local stakeholders, those impacted by the decision, environmental decision making, and the managing institutions, whether they're government or business, that are actually making those choices. Passive participation is more where people are not, people are informed about what has been decided or has already happened, that decisions have been made. There may have been postings about permitting hearings or other things, but postings done in a way that really doesn't reach the community. And so although the formal process, participatory process may have taken place, communities are really only ultimately being informed about decisions and not going any further. Next. Participation by consultation. People participate. They might be consulted, they might answer questions, but external agents really define problems and the information gathering processes. Somebody else controls the analysis. You may have participation from material incentives. People are told, well, if you allow this particular facility to be here, there will be jobs or there will be tax relief, or there'll be other things that benefit the community. Yet once those decisions are made, once the siting has taken place, there's really no real opportunity to continue those practices or participate. Next. And then we have interactive participation, where people actually participate in the joint analysis, in the development action plans and the formation, and self-mobilization, where local people take initiatives that are independent of external institutions in order to change the system. So here we begin to have true community development. Next. And then finally, so to think about meaningful involvement, and as Michael talks now, we'll share with you the Biden policies. Meaningful involvement requires that affected community residents have an appropriate opportunity to participate in decisions, that their contributions can actually influence the businesses or regulatory agencies' decisions, that the concerns of all participants involved will be considered in the decision-making process, and that the decision makers seek out and actually facilitate the involvement of those potentially affected, not just send out notices that they know the community is potentially not equipped to respond to. And with that, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Dean Northern. So don't have a lot of time left, and I have a lot to cover. I don't know if I'll get through all my material because of the time that's left, but if anyone has questions or wants to, discuss these topics offline, I would be happy to do that. I found preparing for this to be very interesting and very fulfilling. So before I get into my material about the Biden administration and what we might expect as members of the environmental bar, or maybe members of industry or environmental professionals, I wanted to just put something out on the table. I think environmental justice is scary. If you're a lawyer and you represent industry, or maybe if you're a manager of an industrial facility or part of an environmental team, because folks in those positions like certainty. We want to know, what do I need to do to get my air permit for my facility? Well, I want to be able to check off the boxes and know I met all the requirements and that I'll get my permit, so that I can tell management that, what's going to happen, and, we've mitigated our risk. A lot of the even legal concepts associated with environmental justice don't lend themselves, at least right now, to that kind of check the box certainty. And I think that makes it scary, to be honest, and that because people don't like uncertainty, especially people in the kind of jobs that I think many of us that are participating in this seminar have. So with that in mind, we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to run through some of the recent history pretty quickly, because most of you have probably read about it already multiple times. But on January 27th, President Biden issued an executive order tackling the climate crisis, basically stating that environmental justice is going to be at the forefront of the administration, not just at EPA, but across the board in the federal government. Specifically directed the Environmental Protection Agency's enforcement office to strengthen enforcement of environmental violations that have a disproportionate impact on underserved communities, and requested that the Attorney General consider renaming the Department of Justice's ENRD, or Environmental and Natural Resources Division, to be the Environmental Justice and Natural Resources Division. I haven't seen any headlines about that actually happening yet, but the request has been made. Next slide. So, but the Biden administration, at least in my opinion, is about more than just talk. They're trying to fund these changes. The most recent budget proposal includes $1.4 billion in funding for environmental justice initiatives. The American Rescue Plan, which the administration put forward and Congress has already passed, included $100 million to address air quality and other environmental health risks, specifically in minority and underserved communities. And it also included $50 million for environmental justice grants to be administered by EPA. And that $50 million is by itself is more than EPA has handed out in environmental justice grants in the past 26 years. So putting that forward all at one time is making a statement. Next slide, please. Michael Regan, the new EPA administrator, has carried forward with President Biden's emphasis on environmental justice. On April 7th, after being confirmed into office, he called for EPA to increase and strengthen the enforcement of environmental and civil rights laws in communities that are overburdened by pollution. Immediately sought to incorporate environmental justice considerations in all aspects of EPA's work, not just enforcement, but rule development also, which can be very important. Next slide. And then here's something I think that's very recent that a lot of people will find interesting. So President Biden issued the executive order. The new administrator, Mr. Regan, emphasize the importance of environmental justice in some of his early discussions after taking office. And now, last week, April 30th, OECA, EPA's enforcement office, issued a memo giving some direction as to how they are going to carry out environmental justice, the emphasis on environmental justice and enforcement. This memo directs enforcement personnel throughout EPA to take steps to advance environmental justice goals consistent with the president's executive order. So they're calling for increased inspections and focusing those inspections on violations that would most affect overburdened communities. And then through the enforcement actions, implementing remedies that'll benefit those communities. And some of the examples that OECA talks about in the memo are bringing back supplemental environmental projects, which had essentially gone away during the Trump administration for a variety of reasons, using mitigation to try to maybe undo or make up for harms that had been done in the past, increasing transparency, which I think goes back to some of the concepts that Dean Northern talked about. And then also the memo talks about using innovative relief. And it's unclear what that is, but one of the examples they gave was imposing fence line monitoring requirements on facilities that have had violations that have, overburdened or underserved communities right across their fence lines, who are most likely to take the brunt of the pollution caused by any violations that may have occurred. Next slide, please. Again, quickly, a lot of this is evolving, as we all know, but there's already been some real world impacts for some folks' projects. So on March 15th, the Department of Transportation suspended a very large federal highway expansion project in Houston based upon environmental justice concerns, and basically concluded that the Texas Department of Transportation had not adequately addressed community concerns when it evaluated the impact of the project. And this tied into the Civil Rights Act because Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits recipients of federal financial assistance, which would include states, from discriminating based upon race, color, or national origin. And so since the state of Texas was receiving federal highway funding for that expansion project, that brought the Civil Rights Act right into the picture. Next slide. Some more real world or recent impacts. The Lime Tree Bay refinery in the US Virgin Islands. The Trump administration had issued a permit to approve the expansion of that refinery in the waning days of the administration. The facility is located in a neighborhood that is probably low income, underserved minority community. And 27% of the residents living near the refinery live below the poverty line. And the Biden EPA, or the EPA now, came in and revoked the permit that had been issued by the prior administration's EPA. That sounds shocking, I think, to a lot of folks that are used to air permitting. One thing to remember about this is that in the Virgin Islands, US EPA directly issues the permits, whereas in probably most places that folks in the audience are located, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, other places, most states are authorized to issue those permits under federally delegated programs. And so the states issue those permits, and the federal government doesn't have the authority to revoke them that directly. They can get at them other ways, but it was a unique circumstance. On May 3rd, also related to that same facility, EPA issued a notice of violation to the same refinery for failing to operate some air monitors that would help everyone determine what the real burden on the community was. Next slide. In issuing that notice of violation for the refinery, EPA expressly noted that it had taken additional interest in that Lime Tree Bay refinery site because of the environmental justice concerns. So there's other real world impacts. To save a little time, I'm going to skip over the next slide, but I'll just say that EPA has historically used the Title V permit objection process to implement new policies through adjudication. We've seen where there was a facility that some environmental groups, NGOs, have requested that EPA object to their permit for a steel facility in Michigan. Trump administration refused to issue that objection because they found that basically the Clean Air Act and the Title V program didn't require those concerns to be addressed. And now there are new petitions being filed for against other permits that raise similar concerns. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the Biden administration or how the Mr. Regan's EPA addresses those. We're coming up on the hour. Couple things real quick, and maybe this is the most important part to me of the program. Wendy, can you go back to the responding to change slide? Thank you. So what can you do if you're an environmental professional, you have a facility, or maybe you're a lawyer at a company, and people come to you and say, you know, what should we do to address these environmental justice? I think the first thing you can do is stay informed. Things are changing quickly, and you have to stay informed and up to date. Second, evaluate your facilities and your current project plan. If you've got facilities that are located in overburdened areas or low income areas or have large minority populations around the fence line, evaluate your compliance. Your kind of facility is exactly the kind of place that EPA might be coming to for an inspection or focusing on. And so if you can head those things off by finding any potential compliance issues yourself and correcting them before those inspections occur, you'll be way ahead of the curve. You should expect increases in enforcement activity. Anticipate a lot more scrutiny in your permitting if you're trying to expand a facility or put a new facility in an area that is in an area that is underserved or has large minority or low income populations, or in areas that have already maybe overburdened by industry or pollution. You should anticipate that your permits are going to get a lot more scrutiny. So consider engaging in some more community outreach. The Professor Northern talked about how the existing laws in your state or locale probably require, you know, notice in the newspaper that a permit's going to be issued and maybe some kind of public hearing, and that a lot of folks in these communities probably don't know how to participate or don't even know that those things are going on. If you want to increase the chances of being able to say that you are responsive to environmental justice issues, consider doing some additional outreach, doing more than what's required by the state or local laws. Think about taking additional measures with your projects that might offset some of the burdens that your project is going to create for the local community, not just by maybe creating some additional jobs, but by taking some positive measures to counteract the health impacts or whatever other impacts your facility might cause. Take measures to increase transparency. Again, these are scary concepts for folks in industry and for lawyers that represent them. At least I think they are. But transparency will lead to trust, and ultimately, I think that's what we're trying to build if we want to avoid environmental justice concerns with your projects and your facilities. Finally, one last thing. I think the most important part of this for folks that work in at facilities or environmental lawyers that represent industry is just getting your head around these issues. I talked to Professor Northern about some ideas that I had, and she was able to raise concerns that I hadn't even thought of. And I suspect that a lot of the folks that are participating in this seminar, listening in, that work at different facilities or maybe represent industry, probably think about some of those same problems the same way that I do or that I have in the past. And finding a way to get out of your own space and finding people that can help you think about these issues differently and maybe try to identify what the folks that live in your community near your facilities are really concerned about will help you address those concerns and mitigate your risk. So that was a lot of information really fast. We're already 2 minutes over. Wendy, I don't know if we've gotten any questions.
No, we do not have any questions yet, but if anybody wants to type some in, we can be sure to get them some answers via email or however works best.
Yeah, that would be great. I think all three of us are happy to follow up with anyone who might have questions. You can go ahead and submit them. Wendy will make sure we get them, and we'll route them to the best person to get you an answer, and someone will either email you or call you, whichever you prefer. And thank you for participating, and we're sorry for going over by a few minutes. Thank you.